In 2015, Russia rolled a machine across Red Square that Western analysts called the most advanced tank on Earth. It had an unmanned turret, a crew sealed in an armored capsule, cut off from its own ammunition, a radar that could see incoming missiles and shoot them out of the air before they arrived. It was called the T-14 Armata, and it was supposed to make every other tank in the world obsolete. Russia announced it would build 2,300 of them. And then the largest tank war since the Second World War broke out, right on Russia's doorstep, in Ukraine. Thousands of tanks have burned in that war. Both sides have thrown everything they have into it, dragging 50-year-old machines out of storage to keep the front supplied with armor. It is the single most tank-hungry conflict of the modern age. And Russia's revolutionary super tank, the one that was going to change everything, it never showed up. In the one war where it was needed most, the T-14 Armata simply stayed home. This is the story of why, and it is one of the most revealing failures of the entire war, because it is not really a story about a tank. It is a story about what happens when a dream weapon collides with sanctions, with economics, and with a $400 drone. Let's start with what the T-14 actually promised, because on paper, it was genuinely a generational leap. This was not just marketing. For 100 years, every tank followed the same basic layout: a crew of men sitting inside a rotating turret, right next to the gun and the ammunition. It worked, but it had a fatal flaw. The turret is the tallest, most exposed part of the tank, and the crew sits inside it, surrounded by shells. One penetrating hit, and the ammunition cooks off in a catastrophic explosion that kills everyone and blows the turret clean off the hull. The grim image that has defined this entire war. The T-14 was designed to end that. Its turret is unmanned, fully robotic, operated remotely from inside the hull. The three crewmen sit together in a heavily armored capsule at the very front, sealed off from both the gun and the ammunition. The idea is simple and powerful. If the tank is hit, the crew has the best chance of surviving in the history of armored warfare, because they are nowhere near the thing that explodes. It carried a powerful new 125mm gun, an autoloader, and a suite of sensors and cameras, giving the crew a full view of the battlefield without ever exposing their heads. To understand why that design was such a big deal, you only have to watch almost any clip of a Russian tank being destroyed in Ukraine. When a shell or a drone sets off the ammunition inside a traditional tank, the stored rounds detonate all at once, in a chain reaction. The blast has nowhere to go but up, and it launches the multi-ton turret dozens of meters into the air, flipping it end over end like a bottle cap. Soldiers grimly call it the jack-in-the-box effect, and it is almost always fatal for everyone inside. The T-14's entire philosophy was built to make that impossible. Put the people in one sealed box, the ammunition in another, and if the tank dies, let the machine die without the men. It was, genuinely, one of the most crew-protective tank designs ever drawn up. Which makes what happened next all the more bitter. Russia designed the tank that best protects its soldiers, and then sent those same soldiers to war in the exact old machines whose turrets fly off. And then there was its crown jewel, the Afghanet Active Protection System. This is the part that made Western tank designers genuinely nervous. Afghanet uses millimeter-wave radar to detect an incoming anti-tank missile, or rocket in flight, track it, and fire a countermeasure to destroy or deflect it before it ever reaches the armor. A tank that could shoot down the very weapons designed to kill it. On paper, the T-14 was not an improved tank. It was a rethink of what a tank is. So Russia had, at least in the design bureau, a machine a generation ahead of anything the West was fielding. It paraded it through Red Square. State media called it unstoppable. The plan was 2,300 of them rolling off the line by 2020, forming the armored spearhead of a modernized Russian army. Almost none of that happened. And to understand why, you have to look at the gap between designing a revolutionary machine and actually building it, at scale, for real, thousands of times over. Because that is where the T-14 died. The first cracks appeared almost immediately, and they were mundane and humiliating. During that very first 2015 parade rehearsal, one of the T-14s broke down and stalled on Red Square, in front of the cameras, and had to be towed away. It was a small thing, but it was a preview. The T-14 was a prototype, a technology demonstrator, and turning a handful of hand-built showpieces into a mass-produced weapon is a completely different and far harder problem. Then the deadline started slipping. The 2,300 target for 2020 quietly evaporated. By 2018, Russia effectively canceled the main production run, and the numbers collapsed to a trickle. Instead of thousands, the manufacturer, Uralvagonzavod, hand-assembled somewhere between 20 and 40 of them in total. Not a production line, but essentially a workshop making bespoke prototypes one at a time. To this day, that is roughly all that exists. And then came the thing that turned a troubled program into a dead one: sanctions. This is the part that matters most, and it connects the T-14 to the entire modern Russian war economy. A tank like the T-14 is not really made of steel, it is made of electronics. The Afghanit radar, the fire control computers, the sensor fusion, the thermal sights, the digital displays, all of it depends on high-end microchips and specialized components that Russia does not make and cannot make. It imported them, and after 2022, Western export controls slammed that door shut. Without those microelectronics, you cannot build the Afghanit system that was the whole point of the tank. You cannot build the sensors. You are left with an expensive hull and no brain to put in it. Ukraine's military intelligence has stated flatly that production of Russia's most advanced tanks, the T-90 and the T-14, has essentially stopped. Which brings us to the most damning admission of all. In early 2026, the head of Russia's giant state defense corporation, Rostec, Sergei Chemezov, was asked publicly why the T-14 Armata was not fighting in Ukraine, and he did not talk about strategy or holding it in reserve for a bigger war. He said simply that the T-14 is too expensive. At a cost estimated somewhere between $5 and $9 million per tank, it costs several times what an ordinary Russian tank costs, and in his own words, it would be more practical to buy a larger number of cheaper machines. The most advanced tank on Earth, killed not by an enemy, but by its own price tag. So while the super tank sat in the garage, what was Russia actually fighting with? This is where the contrast becomes brutal. Russia went to war, and stayed at war, on tanks designed in the 1960s and 1970s, the T-72 and the T-80, upgraded over the decades but fundamentally old machines. And as its losses mounted into the thousands, open-source trackers have confirmed thousands of Russian tanks destroyed, it began doing something almost unthinkable for a supposed tank superpower. It started pulling ancient T-55s and T-62s out of long-term storage, tanks that are 60 and 70 years old, older than the crew's grandfathers, and shipping them to the front. A nation that had promised a fleet of robotic supertanks was in reality dusting off Cold War relics to fill the gap. The T-14 was not just absent, its absence was being covered by museum pieces. But here is the twist, and it is the most important part of the whole story, because even if Russia had somehow built its 2,300 T-14s, even if the sanctions had never bitten, there is a very strong case that it would not have mattered. Because while Russia was failing to build the perfect tank, the war was quietly making the very idea of the perfect tank obsolete. Think about what the Afghanit system was designed to stop. It was built to detect and destroy anti-tank missiles and rockets. Threats that come flying in relatively fast, on a flat trajectory, from the side, the way they did in every war of the late 20th century. That was the threat when the T-14 was designed. But that is not the threat that has actually been destroying tanks in Ukraine. The weapon that has hunted Russian armor to near extinction is the small, cheap, first-person view drone, a machine that costs around $400, built from commercial parts, that does not come streaking in from the side at all. It drifts down slowly and drops onto the tank from directly above, onto the thin roof armor, into the open hatch, straight down onto the weakest point of the entire vehicle. The whole architecture of tank protection, the thick frontal armor, the reactive blocks, and yes, systems like Afghanit tuned for fast horizontal threats, was built for a war that came at the tank from the front and the sides. The drone comes from the sky, slowly, patiently, and for a few $100s, it defeats a machine that costs millions. And no active protection system yet built reliably solves that top attack problem. So the uncomfortable truth is this. The T-14 was designed to win the last tank war, at the exact moment the next one was rendering the entire concept of the multi-million-dollar wonder tank questionable. It was the best possible answer to a question the battlefield had already stopped asking. And lest this seem like a uniquely Russian humiliation, it is not. When the West sent its own top-tier tanks to Ukraine, the American M1 Abrams, the German Leopard 2, they too were hunted by these cheap drones. The Abrams were quietly pulled back from the most exposed frontline sectors after a string of losses, precisely because a 60-ton, multi-million-dollar machine had become dangerously vulnerable to something a single soldier could carry in a backpack. The drone does not care what flag is painted on the tank or how advanced its armor is. So this is not really a story about Russian tanks being bad. It is a story about the age of the tank as the undisputed king of the battlefield quietly coming to an end, and the T-14 just happens to be its most expensive tombstone. If this whole pattern sounds familiar, it should, because it has happened before. Almost exactly. In the Second World War, Nazi Germany became obsessed with building bigger, heavier, more sophisticated tanks. The Tiger, the King Tiger, and the monstrous 60-ton-plus Mouse. Machine for machine, these were superior to almost anything the Allies could field. Better guns, thicker armor, finer engineering. And Germany lost the tank war anyway, because while German factories painstakingly hand-built a few thousand exquisite Tigers, the Soviet Union and the United States mass-produced tens of thousands of cheaper, simpler, good-enough tanks, the T-34 and the Sherman, and simply buried them under sheer numbers. The lesson of that war was written in burning steel. In industrial warfare, a large number of adequate machines beats a small number of perfect ones, almost every single time. The T-14 is Russia repeating, 80 years later, the very same mistake that helped destroy the last regime that tried to win with wonder weapons. A handful of brilliant machines has never been an army. And that is why the story of the T-14 is so much bigger than one failed machine. Pull back, and you can see three separate forces all crushing it at once. First, the engineering gap, the enormous distance between a brilliant prototype and a mass-produced weapon, a distance Russia's industry could not cross. Second, the economic wall, sanctions that cut off the microelectronics a modern weapon absolutely requires, and a price tag so high that even Russia's own defense chief admitted it made no sense. And third, the strategic irony, a revolution in armor arriving just as cheap, disposable drones were making expensive armor a losing bet. Any one of those might have been survivable. All three together were fatal. The T-14 Armata is, in the end, a monument. Not to Russian engineering strength, but to a very particular kind of failure. The failure of the grand, expensive, centralized dream weapon in an age that increasingly belongs to the small, the cheap, and the many. Russia bet on building a handful of perfect, unbeatable machines. Ukraine, out of necessity, bet on building millions of imperfect, disposable ones. And in the most important tank war in generations, it was the $400 drone, not the $8 million super tank, that decided the fate of armor. The most advanced tank on Earth spent the biggest tank war of the century parked safely at home. And by the time anyone might have sent it forward, the war had already written its verdict. Not on the T-14 specifically, but on the entire idea it represented. The future of the battlefield would not be won by the most expensive machine. It would be won by the cheapest one that actually showed up. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand the weapons and the economics quietly rewriting how this war, and the next one, will be fought, stay with us, because the future of war is being built right now, one cheap machine at a time.